At the heart of this hidden tale lies a seemingly perfect family, centered around Sarah Collins, a devoted housewife who had everything one could desire, except the one thing she craved most: love and attention. Her husband, Mark Collins, a successful corporate executive, was frequently away on business, leaving Sarah to manage their beautiful home in the quiet, affluent suburb of Maple Ridge. Together, they had built a life that everyone admired: a lovely house, two well-behaved children, and a marriage that seemed unshakable. Mark was the epitome of a dedicated husband and father. He worked tirelessly to provide for his family, often flying across the country to secure deals and expand his company's reach. Though his job was demanding, it afforded them a life of luxury. Sarah drove the latest model of an SUV. Their children attended the best private schools, and their home was filled with every comfort imaginable. To outsiders, Sarah and Mark were the perfect couple, envied by all in their close-knit community. Yet, beneath this idyllic surface, Sarah felt a growing emptiness. The long, lonely nights without Mark's presence began to wear on her. She spent her days volunteering at school events, hosting dinner parties, and participating in the local book club. But nothing filled the void that his absence left in her heart. The hours she spent alone in their expansive home grew longer, her loneliness more profound. Enter David Pearson, the husband of Sarah's older sister, Rachel. David was everything Mark was not. He was charming, charismatic, and always had time for a chat. As the town's well-respected accountant, David had built a reputation for being trustworthy and reliable. But it was his easygoing nature and magnetic personality that drew people to him, especially Sarah. David and Rachel had been married for over 15 years, and they had a stable, if somewhat unremarkable, marriage. Rachel was kind but practical, more focused on raising their 3 children and managing the household than on romance. Over time, the spark in their marriage had dimmed, leaving David to seek excitement elsewhere. It began innocently enough, a lingering glance at a family gathering, a conversation that lasted a bit too long. Sarah had always admired David from afar, seeing him as the fun-loving, adventurous uncle of her, who could lighten the mood at any family event. But as Mark's absences grew more frequent, so did Sarah's encounters with David. It was as if fate had orchestrated their meetings. A chance encounter at the grocery store, a shared drink at a neighborhood BBQ, or a private moment at a family function. Each time they met, the tension between them grew. Sarah couldn't help but notice how David's eyes lingered on her, how he seemed to find excuses to be near her. She knew it was wrong. David was her uncle by marriage, and she loved her sister deeply. But the thrill of their forbidden connection was too intoxicating to resist. One evening, after a particularly emotional day, Sarah found herself alone with David in the kitchen during one of their family gatherings. The conversation had started innocently, but as they talked, the air between them grew heavy with unspoken desire. Without thinking, David reached out and touched her hand, his fingers lingering just a moment too long. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding as she looked into his eyes. "I shouldn't," said Sarah. "I know," David replied, his voice low and filled with regret. "But I can't stop thinking about you, Sarah." In that moment, the dam broke. The attraction they had both been fighting against for so long finally overpowered their reason. David pulled Sarah into his arms, and she didn't resist. Their kiss was filled with all the passion and longing they had suppressed for months. It was a kiss that changed everything, literally. But if you thought that was it, you're wrong, because from that night on, Sarah and David's lives became entangled in a web of lies and deceit. What began as a moment of weakness quickly spiraled into a full-blown affair, their secret meetings becoming more frequent, more intense. As their affair deepened, so did the danger of being caught. Mark's long absences provided them with ample opportunity, but also with a growing sense of guilt. Sarah loved her husband, but the thrill of her affair with David was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was dangerous, forbidden, and it made her feel alive in a way that her marriage never had. But secrets like theirs could never stay hidden forever. In the small town of Maple Ridge, where everyone knew each other's business, it was only a matter of time before whispers began to spread. The perfect life that Sarah had worked so hard to maintain was beginning to crack, and the consequences of her actions would soon come crashing down on everyone she loved. Their secret rendezvous took place in the most unexpected places. A secluded park on the outskirts of town, an out-of-the-way motel, even the back seat of David's car parked in a quiet wooded area. The thrill of being discovered added a dangerous edge to their encounters, making each moment together more intense than the last. They would steal away whenever they could, the urgency of their need for each other overshadowing the consequences. For Sarah, these moments with David were like a drug. The guilt she felt toward Mark and Rachel was always there, gnawing at her conscience, but the desire she felt for David was too powerful to resist. She knew what they were doing was wrong, yet she couldn't bring herself to stop. David, too, was caught in the grip of their affair. He knew he was betraying Rachel, the woman who had stood by his side for so many years. But with Sarah, he felt alive again. The excitement, the danger, the forbidden nature of their relationship, it all made him feel like a young man again. He told himself that it was just a fling, something that would pass in time. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, he realized that he was in far deeper than he had ever intended. Sarah started telling small lies to cover up her absences, fabricating stories about errands or volunteering, anything that would explain the time she spent away from home. David did the same, finding excuses to leave the house or stay late at work, always with one eye on the clock and the other on his phone, waiting for Sarah's next message. Despite their best efforts, the strain of living a double life began to take its toll on Sarah. She became more distant from Mark, her once cheerful demeanor now clouded by guilt and anxiety. Mark, who had always been preoccupied with work, began to notice the changes in his wife. She was more distracted, often lost in thought, and there were times when she seemed almost desperate to get out of the house. He chalked it up to stress, thinking perhaps the burden of managing everything while he was away was starting to wear on her. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Rachel, too, started to sense that something was off with David. He was more secretive than usual, and there were times when he seemed distant, even when they were together. She noticed the way his phone would buzz late at night, the way he would quickly silence it and claim it was just work. Rachel loved her husband, but she couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that something was going on. One evening, as the family gathered at Rachel and David's house for dinner, Sarah and David exchanged a brief glance across the table. It was subtle, but filled with 1,000 unspoken words. Sarah's heart raced, a mix of excitement and fear coursing through her veins. She knew they were playing with fire, that every interaction risked exposing their secret, but the thrill of it was too much to resist. After dinner, as everyone mingled in the living room, David found an excuse to pull Sarah aside. They slipped into the kitchen, where the sounds of laughter and conversation from the other room masked their hushed voices. As they stood there, close enough to feel each other's breath, the reality of their situation loomed over them like a dark cloud. They were playing a dangerous game, one that could destroy not only their lives, but the lives of those they cared about most. Yet despite the risk, they couldn't bring themselves to walk away. The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of their choices pressing down on them both. Every secret meeting, every stolen kiss, was another step closer to disaster. They knew it, but they were too far gone to turn back now. Mark Collins, always the diligent and observant husband, couldn't ignore the changes in Sarah any longer. He had noticed her growing distance, her frequent absences, and the way she seemed perpetually lost in thought. There were moments when she would be staring off into space, completely unaware of his presence. When he would ask if something was bothering her, Sarah would always smile and say she was fine, blaming her behavior on the stress of managing the household alone while he was away. But Mark wasn't convinced. He knew his wife too well, and something just didn't add up. The little lies she told, the vague explanations for where she had been or what she had been doing, they didn't match up with the Sarah he knew. He began to pay closer attention, watching for any clues that might explain the change in her behavior. And that, just the beginning of the end. It wasn't long before he noticed the late-night phone calls, the messages that she quickly dismissed, and the way she would tense up whenever he entered the room unexpectedly. It was during one of his business trips that Mark decided to dig deeper. He called home one evening, earlier than usual, and was surprised when the call went straight to voicemail. Sarah had told him she would be home all night, so why wasn't she answering? His mind raced with possibilities, but he forced himself to remain calm. Maybe she had just stepped out for a moment, or maybe the phone was on silent. But the nagging feeling in his gut told him something else was going on. But that wasn't all, because the next morning, Mark returned home earlier than expected, hoping to surprise Sarah. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed an unfamiliar car parked a few houses down. He didn't think much of it until he saw Sarah step out of their front door, glancing around nervously before walking toward the car. Mark's heart dropped as he watched her get into the passenger seat and drive away. He followed them at a distance, his mind racing with questions. Who was she with? Where were they going? The car eventually pulled into the parking lot of a small, out-of-the-way motel on the outskirts of town. Mark parked his car a few spaces away, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He watched as Sarah and the driver, a man, got out and walked into the motel together, their heads close as they spoke in hushed tones. Mark's blood ran cold. He couldn't see the man's face, but he didn't need to. The way Sarah acted around him, the familiarity with which they moved, it was clear that this wasn't their first time here. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him as the realization hit him like a freight train. Sarah was having an affair. Meanwhile, Rachel Pearson was dealing with her own suspicions. David's behavior had become increasingly erratic in recent weeks. He was often late coming home, claiming he had been caught up at work or running errands. He seemed distracted, always checking his phone and keeping it close, even when he was at home. Rachel, who had always trusted her husband implicitly, was starting to feel the first pangs of doubt. One evening, after David had gone to bed early, Rachel noticed his phone buzzing on the nightstand. She picked it up, planning to silence it, when she saw a message preview flash on the screen. It was from Sarah, and the message read, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. I miss you." Rachel's heart stopped. The words were innocent enough, but something about the tone didn't sit right with her. She quickly put the phone back, her mind racing. Was she reading too much into it? Sarah was her sister, after all, and they were close. But why would Sarah be texting David late at night about meeting up? The thought gnawed at her, but she didn't confront David right away. Instead, she decided to keep a closer eye on him. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Rachel finally decided to confront Sarah. They were sitting in Sarah's living room, sipping tea and chatting about the upcoming school fundraiser, when Rachel casually asked, "Have you seen much of David lately? He's been so busy with work, I hardly see him anymore." Sarah's hand froze mid-air, her teacup hovering just inches from her lips. "Oh, no, not really," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Why do you ask?" Rachel shrugged, pretending to be indifferent and just curious. Sarah's mind raced, trying to come up with a plausible response. She said that she hasn't seen him much and that he must be working hard, just like Mark. The tension between the two sisters was palpable, each of them hiding their own dark secrets. As Rachel left Sarah's house that afternoon, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. And Sarah, for her part, knew that the walls were closing in. The lies she had told to keep her affair with David hidden were starting to catch up with her, and she feared it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The storm outside mirrored the tension building inside Sarah's heart. She knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The thrill of her affair with David had long been replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. Every glance from Mark, every question from Rachel, felt like a noose tightening around her neck. Mark had grown increasingly suspicious, his once loving gaze now filled with doubt. He had noticed the changes in Sarah, her late-night absences, the secretive phone calls, and the way she would avoid his touch. The pieces were falling into place, and Mark could no longer ignore the truth. That evening, Mark told Sarah he was going out for a drive. She nodded, barely looking up as he left. But instead of going far, Mark circled back, parking a few houses down where he had a clear view of their home. He watched and waited, the rain pounding on the windshield, his heart a steady drumbeat of anger and betrayal. Inside, Sarah paced nervously, glancing at the clock. She had arranged to meet David, but something felt off. The thrill that had once excited her now filled her with a sense of impending doom. Still, she couldn't resist the pull, the need to see him one last time. She grabbed her coat and hurried out the door. Mark watched as she left, his suspicions confirmed. He followed her, keeping his distance, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Sarah drove to a familiar spot, an out-of-the-way motel on the edge of town. Mark's stomach churned as he pulled into the parking lot a few minutes after her, his worst fears playing out before his eyes. Inside the motel room, Sarah found David already waiting. The air between them was thick with tension, neither of them able to ignore the gravity of the situation any longer. They both knew the end was near, that their secret couldn't stay hidden forever. But before they could speak, there was a loud knock at the door. Mark's knock was heavy, deliberate, the kind that told them he knew. Panic flashed in Sarah's eyes as she looked at David, her heart racing. David, trying to maintain his composure, opened the door slowly. The sight of Mark standing there, soaked from the rain and seething with rage, sent a shiver down his spine. Without a word, Mark pushed past David, his eyes burning with fury as they locked onto Sarah. She took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no escape, no more lies to hide behind. The truth was out, and now they had to face the consequences. The room was small, too small to contain the explosion of emotion that followed. Mark's anger boiled over. His fists clenched at his sides as he stared down the man who had betrayed him. David tried to reason with him, but the words were lost in the storm of Mark's wrath. In a flash, the confrontation turned physical. Mark lunged at David, his rage overpowering any sense of restraint. The two men grappled, crashing into furniture, the room filled with the sound of grunts and the shattering of glass. Sarah screamed, trying to pull them apart, but she was shoved aside in the chaos. In the heat of the struggle, Mark's hand found a heavy brass lamp on the nightstand. In one swift, brutal motion, he swung it with all his might. The impact was sickening, the sound of bone cracking echoing through the room. David crumpled to the floor, blood pooling around his head, his eyes staring lifelessly at the ceiling. Sarah's scream pierced the air, her hands trembling as she knelt beside David's body. The man she had once thought she loved was gone, his life snuffed out in a moment of uncontrollable rage. Mark stood over them, panting, the lamp still gripped in his bloodied hand, the reality of what he had done slowly sinking in. There was no time to react, no time to think. The storm outside raged on, but inside the motel room, the world had come to a standstill. Mark dropped the lamp, the sound of it hitting the floor barely registering in his mind. He turned to Sarah, his face twisted with a mix of horror and guilt, but also a cold satisfaction. He had taken his revenge. But it wasn't over. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, crushing any sense of victory. He had destroyed everything: his marriage, his family, and now, another man's life. The only thing left was the suffocating silence that filled the room. A silence that screamed louder than any words ever could. Sarah, sobbing uncontrollably, could barely process what had just happened. The man she loved was dead, and the man she had betrayed was responsible. The walls seemed to close in on her, the reality of their doomed affair finally sinking in. In a final act of despair, Mark turned away, unable to face the devastation he had caused. The door to the motel room slammed shut behind him as he disappeared into the night, leaving Sarah alone with the lifeless body of the man who had torn her life apart. The storm outside began to subside, but inside, the damage was irreparable. The deadly consequences of their actions had come to a brutal, bloody end, leaving nothing but shattered lives and broken hearts in their wake. In the end, Mark has been arrested by the police, and Sarah, she will have to go through life without her spouse, but also without David, the man she secretly loved so much. Do you want to see more like this? Then click on the video you're seeing on your screen now.